Welcome back. Picture a September morning in the year 1650. Fog still clinging low over a harbor at the southern tip of an island the Lenape people called Mannahatta. A rooster crows somewhere behind a wall of split logs. A Dutch trading ship, its hull barnacled from the long Atlantic crossing, creaks against a wooden pier while sailors haul barrels of beaver pelts toward a warehouse whose timbers still smell of fresh pine sap. Gulls circle low over the mudflats at low tide, picking through debris left by the receding water. Children chase a pig down a muddy lane that has no name yet, only a direction, laughing as a woman in a linen cap leans out a half-open shutter to shout after them. Roughly 1,000 people live within shouting distance of this waterfront: Dutch farmers and craftsmen, enslaved Africans forced into labor, English refugees drifting south from the stricter colonies of New England, and Lenape traders who still, in these years, outnumber the newcomers across the wider island beyond the wall. None of them know that within 14 years everything around them, the language spoken in the streets, the flag flying over the fort, even the very name of the settlement itself, will change forever. Using AI-assisted reconstructions, historic Dutch paintings and survey maps, and archaeological findings pulled from beneath the streets of modern Manhattan, we are going to walk through this vanished town as it actually looked, before it became one of the most recognizable cities on Earth. And by the end, you will see exactly where these same streets and shorelines sit today, buried under skyscrapers, subway tunnels, and pavement that most people cross every day without a second thought. Long before any of this, the island had a completely different rhythm. For thousands of years, communities of Lenape people moved seasonally across the region, fishing the tidal creeks that once threaded through what is now Lower Manhattan, planting corn, beans, and squash in cleared fields using a method of interplanting that European farmers found unusually efficient, and following well-worn trails that cut through dense stands of oak, hickory, and chestnut. They called the wider harbor region Lenapoking, and their paths, remarkably, would later become some of the very first streets of European settlement, including a well-traveled trail that Dutch colonists eventually widened and paved, calling it simply the Broad Way. When Europeans first arrived in the early 17th century, they found not an empty wilderness, as later mythology liked to claim, but a landscape already carefully shaped by centuries of deliberate human use. Oyster middens taller than a person were piled along the shoreline, some of them containing shells accumulated over hundreds of years. Controlled burns kept meadows open for deer and other game. Fishing weirs of woven branches were strung across narrow streams to trap herring during their spring runs. The Dutch West India Company, a trading company chartered in 1621 and driven far more by the promise of profitable furs than by any interest in permanent farmland, established a modest post here in the 1620s, naming it New Amsterdam after the great port city its investors called home. Its earliest structures were nothing to admire. A handful of bark-covered huts, dug partly into the earth for insulation against the winter cold, a crude counting house for weighing and recording pelts, and Fort Amsterdam, a squat, roughly built fortification whose walls were still unfinished dirt embankments rather than the cut stone the company back in Holland had promised its investors and its colonists alike. The people who first pounded stakes into this soil had no way of knowing they were laying the groundwork for what would one day become the financial capital of the world. To them, it was simply a cold, damp, mosquito-plagued outpost at the ragged edge of an unmapped continent, a place many of them had come to only because opportunities at home had run out. By 1650, New Amsterdam had grown into something considerably more substantial, though it would still look almost unrecognizably small and improvised to modern eyes. The settlement stretched across roughly the southern tip of the island, an area you could walk from end to end in perhaps 15 unhurried minutes, protected on its northern edge by a defensive wall of upright wooden palisades, the very wall that would one day lend its name, quite literally, to a street called Wall Street. Fort Amsterdam anchored the southwestern corner of the town, its earthen bastions faced with stone by this point after years of complaints, mounting a modest battery of iron cannons pointed out toward the harbor mouth as both a defensive measure and a none-too-subtle warning to rival powers. Inside its walls stood a small stone church with a steeply peaked roof, doubling as both a house of worship and the administrative headquarters for the Dutch West India Company's local officials, along with a windmill whose sails turned lazily against the sky, grinding imported and locally grown grain for a population that depended on it for daily bread. Along the East River shoreline, docks and a canal, dug entirely by hand and lined with squared timber, allowed ships to load and unload directly into the heart of the settlement, an engineering choice that Dutch colonists borrowed straight from the canal cities of their homeland, where water moved goods far more efficiently than muddy roads ever could. The streets themselves were unpaved and often ankle-deep in mud after a hard rain, lined with steep-roofed brick and timber houses built in a recognizably Dutch style, their gable ends facing the street rather than their long sides, their front stoops used for evening gossip, pipe smoking, and watching the world pass slowly by. Construction was constant, contested, and imperfect. Company records from these very years complain repeatedly about the fort's crumbling walls, about houses crowded together in direct violation of fire ordinances meant to prevent the kind of blaze that could level a wooden town in an afternoon, and about a long-promised new stone church that took years longer to complete than the congregation had been told to expect. This was never a finished, polished place. It was a working, half-built settlement that smelled of tar, wood smoke, brine, and low tide all at once, its residents endlessly patching, expanding, and arguing bitterly over how, and how fast, it should grow. At the center of civic and spiritual life stood that small stone church inside the fort, home to the Dutch Reformed congregation whose services were, for a time, the only officially sanctioned form of public worship in the colony, a policy that created real friction as the population diversified. Nearby, though for much of this period only informally, functioned the Stadhuis or City Hall, which by mid-century still operated for a time out of a converted tavern before a proper building was finally designated for the purpose in 1653. Here, a council of company-appointed officials and, increasingly, elected burgomasters and schepens handled the daily business of governance, disputes over property lines, unpaid debts, public drunkenness, and questions of trade regulation, applying a version of Dutch law that was, for its era, notably pragmatic and relatively tolerant, especially compared to the strict Puritan colonies just to the north. Sephardic Jewish refugees fleeing Portuguese persecution in Dutch Brazil arrived in 1654 aboard a ship that had itself been captured by pirates along the way, and though the colony's notoriously stubborn Director-General, Peter Stuyvesant, petitioned company directors back in Amsterdam to expel them outright, the company's shareholders, many of them Jewish investors themselves, overruled him and insisted the refugees be allowed to stay. It is a small but genuinely telling episode, one that reveals a settlement which, out of hard commercial necessity far more than any lofty idealism, tolerated a striking mix of nationalities and faiths rarely found together elsewhere in colonial North America at the time. Court records from these years reveal ordinary disputes rendered in extraordinary, almost novelistic detail, arguments over stray pigs rooting through a neighbor's garden, accusations of slander shouted across a fence line, formal complaints lodged about excessive drinking and rowdy behavior near the tavern district, offering historians today an unusually intimate window into the daily grievances and small dramas of people who otherwise left few written records of their own. Walking those muddy, crowded lanes on an ordinary weekday, you would have encountered a startlingly diverse population for such a small place. Historians estimate as many as 18 different languages were spoken among the roughly 700 to 1,000 residents who lived within the settlement proper by mid-century, a linguistic diversity that astonished visitors from more homogeneous European towns. Dutch farmers sold produce from small garden plots tucked behind their houses, while itinerant traders hawked goods brought upriver from farms scattered along the Hudson. Enslaved Africans, whose forced labor the West India Company had relied upon for construction, farming, and skilled trade work from the colony's very earliest years, moved through the streets under a brutal legal system that nonetheless offered a narrow, precarious path the Dutch called half-freedom, a status that granted limited rights while still denying full equality or security to those who held it, and which could be revoked at the company's discretion. Beer was consumed in genuinely enormous quantities, partly out of custom and partly because it was often considered safer to drink than the local well water, and taverns, sometimes called tap houses or herbergs, functioned as the settlement's true social centers, where sailors fresh off incoming ships, farmers in from the countryside, and company officials in their formal collars all mixed, argued, gambled, and traded news of home. Waste ran openly in the gutters that lined the unpaved streets. Livestock wandered loose often enough that the town eventually appointed dedicated officials specifically tasked with rounding up stray hogs and fining their careless owners. Smoke from cooking fires, forges, and tobacco pipes hung low over the rooftops on still, humid days. It was crowded, loud, occasionally chaotic, and by the polished standards of European cities back home, remarkably improvised. A frontier trading post straining to imitate the orderly, canal-laced towns its residents remembered fondly from the Dutch Republic, with only mixed and often comical success. Craftsmen worked in the open air as much as indoors, coopers hammering barrel staves into shape for the fur trade, blacksmiths hunched over forges that threw sparks into the evening dusk, and bakers whose ovens filled entire blocks with the smell of rye bread before dawn. Children too young for real labor ran errands between houses or minded younger siblings on the front stoops, while older boys were often apprenticed out to tradesmen by the age of 10 or 11, learning a craft that might occupy the rest of their lives. Class lines, though far less rigid than in the great cities of Europe, were still visible everywhere if you knew how to read them, in the quality of a coat, the presence or absence of glass window panes, the difference between a house with a proper cellar and one without. Sickness moved quickly through the crowded lanes in warmer months, and the settlement's small population meant that an outbreak of dysentery or fever could be felt by nearly everyone within weeks, whether through a sick neighbor, a shuttered shop, or a hastily dug grave. And yet amid all this hardship there was also genuine festivity, feast days tied to the Dutch Reformed calendar, harvest celebrations that blended Dutch, English, and indigenous customs in ways historians are still piecing together, and the simple pleasure of a warm evening spent outside a tavern door with a mug of beer and neighbors who, for all their squabbles, depended on one another completely to survive the winters ahead. If New Amsterdam had a single landmark of public gathering and civic pride, it was the harbor itself, along with the market that grew up steadily alongside it, later formalized as a produce market and, in one of the settlement's darker chapters, an enslaved persons market established near the foot of what is now Wall Street. Ships arrived from the Dutch Republic, from other struggling colonies scattered along the Atlantic coast, and directly from West Africa, and the docks buzzed constantly with the business of furs, tobacco, salted fish, timber, and the deeply troubling human trafficking that fueled so much of the broader Atlantic economy during this era. The waterfront was where news arrived first, carried ashore by exhausted sailors along with letters, rumors of war back in Europe, and occasionally disease that spread quickly through the cramped town. It was where the settlement's fortunes visibly rose and fell with the tide of incoming cargo, where a poor harvest of furs upriver could be felt within weeks in the price of bread at the market stalls. This was the town's true public square long before any formal plaza was ever laid out, a place of genuine spectacle in the sense that everyone, regardless of station, came down to the water to watch what the ships had brought in, and to catch the latest word from a world most of them would never see with their own eyes. For a glimpse of privilege in a settlement that otherwise offered very little of it, look to the Bowery or farm estate that Peter Stuyvesant established just north of the settlement's protective wall, a sprawling property complete with its own private chapel, carefully tended orchards, and a comfortable, well-built farmhouse, all of it worked in large part by enslaved laborers whose names rarely survive in the historical record. Stuyvesant, a peg-legged former soldier who had lost part of his leg to a cannonball in an earlier campaign and who governed the colony with famously little patience for dissent or debate, entertained visiting officials and merchants at that estate, treating it as something close to a private domain set apart from the crowded, muddy town below. Compared to the cramped, shared wooden houses most residents called home, it represented a genuinely different world, one of orchards, private worship, and quiet fields rather than shared gutters and stray livestock. Yet whatever comfort and status that estate offered its owner, it would prove no shield at all against the storm gathering unseen on the horizon. Wealth and rank would not decide who ultimately kept control of this place in the years just ahead. The turning point arrived in the closing days of August in 1664, when 4 English warships, larger and better armed than anything the small colony could hope to match, appeared without warning in the outer harbor under the command of Colonel Richard Nichols, acting on the authority of King Charles II's own brother, the Duke of York, who had simply been granted the entire territory on paper months earlier regardless of who actually lived there or how long they had called it home. Stuyvesant, furious and characteristically defiant, wanted to fight to the last man and reportedly tore up the English demand for surrender with his own hands before advisors and prominent townspeople convinced him to reconsider. But the settlement's roughly 1,500 residents by that point, spread across a lightly defended fort with barely enough gunpowder for a token resistance and no realistic hope of relief from home, had little appetite for a battle they were almost certain to lose, especially against a force some historians estimate carried several hundred trained soldiers. Merchants worried openly about their trade goods and warehouses. Farmers worried about their fields and livestock going up in flames. In the days before the surrender, rumors swept through the crowded streets faster than any official announcement. Some residents believing a full bombardment was imminent. Others convinced the English intended only to demand tribute and sail on. Word spread that the English terms of surrender offered generous guarantees of property rights and religious freedom to anyone who did not take up arms, terms that made resistance feel, to many ordinary residents, like a needless risk taken on behalf of a distant company that had never much looked after their interests to begin with. A group of leading townspeople, roughly 93 of them by some accounts, quietly signed a petition urging Stuyvesant to negotiate rather than resist, a document that effectively sealed the outcome before a single cannon was fired. On September 8, 1664, after tense but largely bloodless negotiations rather than any violent siege, New Amsterdam formally surrendered without a single shot fired in its defense, and the Dutch flag over Fort Amsterdam came down for the final time. The English promptly renamed the settlement New York, in honor of the Duke himself, and while daily life continued for most residents with startling, almost eerie ordinariness in the days and weeks that followed, farmers still tending fields, merchants still weighing pelts, the legal, political, and eventually the cultural identity of the entire place shifted permanently and irreversibly beneath the feet of people who mostly just kept opening their shops and tending their gardens the very next morning, uncertain of exactly what had changed but sensing that something fundamental had. In the decades that followed, much of Dutch New Amsterdam was steadily absorbed and physically erased by the town that grew up in its place. The old wooden palisade wall was finally torn down by 1699, its timbers repurposed or simply left to rot, and its street plan was gradually overwritten first by English naming conventions and later, far more dramatically, by the ambitious Commissioner's Plan of 1811, which imposed a rigid, efficient street grid across the entire remaining length of Manhattan Island, sweeping aside whatever irregular Dutch lanes and cowpaths had survived until then. Fort Amsterdam itself, its usefulness long outlived, was finally demolished in 1790 to make way for new construction. Dutch place names lingered on stubbornly even as the Dutch language itself faded from daily use, Bowery surviving from Bowery, Wall Street surviving from that vanished palisade, Broadway surviving from the old Lenape Trail the Dutch had simply paved over and widened, but the physical fabric of the actual 17th-century town was almost entirely paved over, filled in with landfill along an ever-expanding shoreline, or built directly upon as the growing city expanded relentlessly northward and outward across reclaimed marshland and mudflats that most modern New Yorkers would never guess once existed beneath their feet. It was not until the 20th and especially the 21st centuries, through careful, often painstaking archaeological digs conducted ahead of major modern construction projects, that meaningful physical fragments of this lost town finally resurfaced into daylight. Excavations near the original shoreline uncovered Dutch ceramic shards glazed in recognizable blues and browns, clay tobacco pipe stems by the hundreds, the stone linings of old wells long since filled in, and the actual remnants of that hand-dug 17th-century canal, offering solid physical confirmation of a world previously known mostly through scattered company ledgers, old survey maps, and second-hand descriptions written by visitors. Archaeologists working near what came to be called the African Burial Ground, rediscovered by construction crews in 1991 during the excavation for a new federal office building in Lower Manhattan, uncovered the preserved remains of more than 400 individuals, evidence that dramatically reshaped public understanding of just how central enslaved labor had been to building this colony from its very earliest years, a hard truth that had long been underrepresented, and in many tellings, entirely absent from popular histories of the city's founding. It is worth pausing here simply to remember that beneath the glass towers, subway platforms, and endless foot traffic of Lower Manhattan today, there once stood real homes, real gardens, real workshops, and real people arguing over property lines and stray pigs in a language most of their descendants would never learn to speak. Ordinary people built genuine lives there, not knowing their small, muddy, hard-won trading post would one day anchor a global city, or that empire, ambition, and a change of flag would rename their home entirely before most of them had even grown old. Today, if you walk that same stretch of ground, you will find almost nothing standing above the surface from 1650, And yet the outline of that vanished town is still remarkably traceable if you know precisely where to look. Wall Street runs exactly along the line of the old wooden palisade, its modern towers rising directly above where cannons once pointed outward at a threat that never came from that direction. Broadway still follows, in its lower stretches near the harbor, the gentle curve of that ancient Lenape Trail, meaning that millions of pedestrians and tourists walk that same path today without ever knowing its true age. The site of Fort Amsterdam is now occupied by the Alexander Hamilton U.S. Custom House near Bowling Green, itself a monumental early 20th century building faced in granite, though a small plaque and the surrounding park's distinctive oval shape quietly nod to the fort that once dominated the same spot. Stuyvesant's Bowery is long gone, its orchards and chapel replaced entirely by dense city blocks of apartment buildings and storefronts, though Stuyvesant Street, cutting at a strange and stubborn diagonal angle against the surrounding numbered grid, still marks the exact boundary of his old farm precisely as it was laid out nearly 4 centuries ago, a small geometric ghost hiding in plain sight. The African burial ground is now preserved as a national monument near City Hall, with a dedicated visitor center where recovered artifacts, research findings, and the stories of those long unacknowledged residents are on public display, offering a form of remembrance that came centuries too late but arrived nonetheless. And the harbor itself, though its original shoreline has been pushed hundreds of feet outward by centuries of accumulated landfill, still functions today as one of the busiest and most important ports in the world, carrying forward, almost poetically, the very same commercial pulse that first drew Dutch traders to this unlikely island nearly 400 years ago. Thank you so much for spending this time with me, walking through a version of Manhattan that most people who live there today never stop to imagine beneath their feet. If you enjoyed uncovering this hidden layer of New York story, let me know down in the comments which vanished place or forgotten moment you would like to see brought back to life next. And if you have thoughts on how to make these reconstructions even more vivid or historically accurate, I would genuinely love to hear them. See you in the next one.